I was asked to talk a little bit about how we start to think through how we're going to implement the components of the Secure Pork Supply Plan. So I'm going to kind of take that approach here. I'm going to touch on just a little bit, some of our previous speakers did, about what the FAD response looks like in the United States and kind of how the Secure Pork Supply Plan fits into that response. And then talk mainly about focusing on the components of the plan and kind of how we're looking to implement those. So, as Juan mentioned, the diseases covered in the Secure Pork Supply Plan are foot and mouth disease, classical swine fever, and African swine fever. There's also plans, as Marie mentioned, in Secure Milk Supply and Secure Beef Supply. They're focusing on FMD. So we got a little ambitious and figured we're focusing on FMD as they are, but why not throw CSF and ASF in at the same time and go ahead and develop the plan, because it's going to be very similar as it would have been for FMD. We do have some different handouts for producers on our website. There's 3 over the diseases. They're just a one-page handout. Cover a little bit about what the clinical signs are for each of the diseases, how the diseases are spread, and kind of where they are in the world right now, so they have an idea of the effect of some of these diseases. Just a very simple visual for them to look at. Another thing to keep in mind that these are not public health or food safety concerns. So the USDA response plan. So if we were infected in the United States with one of these 3 diseases, they would turn to the different response plans that are out there right now. There's the foot and mouth disease response plan, otherwise known as the Red Book. Same for classical swine fever. And then there's an African swine fever response strategy. And these documents outline kind of how the response would go. So if you ever want to look these over, know that they're out there. You can go onto the website and look at them. I don't remember how long some of them are, but I was thinking the foot and mouth disease response plan's over 200 pages, so there's a lot of information there. Another foreign animal disease preparedness and response document is the phases and types document. So this document kind of addresses how the response will change over time. It may be a matter that the response that would be different if it's a very small focal outbreak. Although after hearing 10 to 12 days before we see it in a herd, I'm thinking it's going to be more like a type 5, which would be 6, 7 states already involved before it's first diagnosed, which is absolutely terrifying. So, but this highlights how the response will change depending on how big the outbreak is and where it's at in the United States. And it goes all the way up to if it includes Canada and Mexico at the same time that we're infected. So as was stated, you can see there that you'll have the infected premises, you'll have the zone around the infected premises, you'll have the buffer zone, and then that whole thing is the control area. So you see all these dots that are in the yellow areas, and they're not infected, but they're also going to be affected by all the movement restrictions. So those are the ones that we're focusing on for the secure pork supply, is how can we keep animals on those production sites moving when the animals are showing no evidence of infection, but they're affected by the quarantine and the movement restrictions that come with that. So that's kind of how it fits into the foreign animal disease response. So that's what we just said, that they're affected by the movement controls but not infected. And I know Juan also stated that this is a voluntary program. So we do have a summary document. As was stated, it's on the securepork.org website. It provides guidance. The overall summary plan is just a 7-page document, and it links to a lot of other different documents. Highlights the different things as far as some biosecurity surveillance and so on. This has been a collaborative effort. So at the end, I'm not going to have an acknowledgement page, because if I did, I'd have to include probably over 100 people, as far as all of them that have been on the working groups. We've taken stuff from the milk side and the beef side that applied, and they've had all of their collaborators and reviewers and the pilot plans and everything. So there's a lot of people, many people in here that have helped work on the plan. So it's a big effort. Again, we talked about it being voluntary. All of our things that we've developed have been funded through the USDA or the National Pork Board, and there's lots of resources that are available. So as was talked about, when the officials are going to be faced with issuing a movement permit to allow these animals to move off a production site, they have to balance the risk of not allowing that live animal movement with, as Marie said, the unintended consequence of what happens on the welfare side if they don't allow the animals to move. So that's one of the things that they're going to be looking at. and what might influence their decisions. How confident are they that those animals are not infected if they're going to allow them to move? Are they risking moving the disease around? Again, the phase and types. Is it a smaller outbreak or is it one that's affecting several states? What is the status of the destination state, or are there states in between that these shipment would be crossing that they are also not infected? What about the final destination? Is it a control area? Are the animals going to slaughter? Maybe they'd be more likely to issue a movement permit for animals going to a packing plant than they would animals going to another site of production. Are we going to have the tool of vaccination, and how is that going to change things at that time? And then, of course, what are the consequences of not allowing the movement? Are those animals all going to have to be euthanized, even though they're healthy animals, just because they can't get a movement permit to move off the site? So they have a lot of things to think about as they're making their decisions. So how can we prepare at the production level prior to the outbreak? And this was mentioned about the pin, so it's not something I'm going to beat to death, because Juan did a very good job of talking about how important it is to have the longitude, latitude, and the 911 address actually be the location of the animals. There was a lot of time wasted in the high-path AI outbreak of the officials having to go through and verify pins before they could issue movement permits. I mean, there were a lot of people that were looking at the pin, finding if animals were actually at that location before they could issue the movement permit. So the pork industry has done a great job of making sure that everyone's getting a PIN number. So it'd be good prior to the outbreak to make sure that those animals, as they're doing with this project, that the animals are at the location where it's stated on the PIN. And the other good thing is to start associating, as he said, the PIN with the movements, but also the PIN with your diagnostic lab submissions, because that's the way that they connect all the information together during an outbreak, is that PIN number. So does the PIN, that site, have a biosecurity plan, which we'll get into in a minute? Have you done all the diagnostic testing that's required? And if they're going to marry that information map to the site, they need that PIN on there. So it's a good thing to start putting that PIN number on those submissions now and get into the habit of it. You know, we talk about biosecurity, and one thing that we have to keep in mind, that routine biosecurity is not going to be enough in the case of a foreign animal disease. That, you know, to many of our endemic diseases, we have some kind of herd immunity. Maybe it's vaccination, maybe it's exposure, but we have some kind of a herd immunity in many cases. And so we have a lower level of pathogen shedding. You know, we get hit with FMD, ASF, and CSF. We have no herd immunity. I mean, there's going to be a lot of pathogen shedding going on. So routine biosecurity, which is why we're throwing out the term that it needs to be an enhanced biosecurity that needs to be implemented on these sites. So what the plan talks about is how each production site needs to have a site-specific biosecurity plan. And producers can use information. We have a biosecurity checklist that has biosecurity measures to implement on the site. They can also use an information manual, which gives them some ideas on how to implement those. And then we also recently just came out with these biosecurity templates. So there's two different versions. As you can see, it says at the top of that one, name of the site in brackets. So you can take that version and you can electronically type in your information anywhere there's the brackets. If there's phone numbers or it asks how you do certain things, you can just type it in, and it's a template for the biosecurity. Then it also comes in to where instead of the brackets to type it in, there's a line. So for somebody that maybe isn't as tech savvy and doesn't want to do it on the computer, they can print it off and they can handwrite it in. The idea is to get a site-specific plan for how they're going to implement these measures on that site. Because we recognize that there's a lot of differences between layout. You know, what happens and works in Texas at a site may not work in Minnesota. So it allows for you to fill in how you can accomplish those measures and meet what is needed in the checklist. One of the things that is asked for is to have a site layout map. And so I did this off of a Google Earth map of a finishing site that I used to go to when I was in practice. And we asked certain things to be identified on the site. So this case, we drew in the lines and how I would change that site in order to be able to implement everything that's included in the checklist and how they could do that. We have a document that talks about how you can create a map, so producers can look at that. And we're working on one on how you can just print off the Google Earth and then they could actually take colored pencils or something like that to draw it in if this freaks them out to try to draw all these lines and things with the computer. So as long as they have the site map with their plan. So what we talk about is having a biosecurity manager on the site. And this is something that they learned from high-path AI, when there was an issue with biosecurity compliance on the site. So by adding a biosecurity manager to the site, and I think poultry might still call it an officer. We had officer at one point, but we found that with some of the employees on the site, officer meant someone of police authority, and that can be a little scary. So the manager is meant to be somebody who is on the site that is there all the time anyway, and it's just someone who's familiar with the site, making sure that people follow the biosecurity measures. So the biosecurity manager is to make sure that the site-specific biosecurity plan gets written, that there's employee training, I'll get to that in a minute, and that they ensure that the biosecurity measures are followed on the site. A couple of the things that we talk about in the biosecurity checklist, one is the perimeter buffer area. And it's an area that's established around the buildings to minimize the contamination near the buildings. So if you can reduce the viral load around the buildings, you're going to reduce the chances of bringing the disease into the buildings. This was something that those that remember Jim McKean, he was very passionate. This was his idea to implement this buffer area. And then the idea is that you don't enter that buffer area without following biosecurity measures. So it may be something that a feed truck driver doesn't cross into that area unless they put on booties and gloves or hand sanitizer if they're planning on climbing up to the bin to open the feed bin. So things like that to minimize the traffic in that area. And then there's the line of separation. Many of you are familiar with this. It used to always be called the clean dirty line. It's the walls of the building housing the pigs. And if you're going to enter in through one of those doorways and cross that line of separation, you need to follow biosecurity measures. We talk in the plan about that means site-specific coveralls or clothing, changing footwear, washing your hands or showering, whatever's available on that site. We went through and just put a couple examples. There's all kinds of different site layouts are there. This is just an example of if you have so you can see that there's the LOS access point there. That would be an employee entry. It'd be nice to have an employee entry that's specific, that they're entering in one area where you can keep the biosecurity measures, everything right there as far as the coveralls, the clothing, boots, and so on. And once they're within the buildings, this example has covered walkways, enclosed walkways that they can move between the buildings. If they cross out into the PBA, which is that blue area there, then they need to come back in and follow entry protocols. You have the LOS access points would be at the loadout area also. So you can kind of see, many of these things are what sites do right now. One of the things that complicates it is, this would be an example of a site that I used to go to that they had 4 finishing buildings. Well, there's not a lot of room as you walk into a finisher to do the steps we're talking about. So in this example, a small building was added, kind of like you think of a lawn shed type, something like that, where employees can enter on one side, do a bench entry system, change into site-specific coveralls, boots, wash their hands, use hand sanitizer or whatnot, come out the other side so where they're in the PBA, and then when they enter the building, you still have a line of separation right inside the building where they would change into their boots as they walk into the building. So still they need to take that one more step. But the idea is if there's lower viral load in the perimeter buffer area, most likely that's going to be on their boots, and if they cross into that line of separation and take more biosecurity measures, that'll help reduce the risk. So again, what can be done ahead of time? Producers can look at right in their site-specific biosecurity plan. They can implement those measures that can be implemented pre-outbreak and prepare and have a plan on how they're going to implement those measures that they cannot implement prior to the outbreak. It's just mentioned about inclement weather, right? So it's always good to have Plan B. What are you going to do when it is icy and very cold? Are you going to have a sheltered C&D area, another off-site location? What are you going to do in a stop movement? And we ask people just to come up with or think through what their contingency plans are. And the main thing we include this in the biosecurity is so that we know that they're thinking through from a biosecurity standpoint what happens if they are going to have to euthanize animals because they can't move them. Do they have the ability to do some carcass disposal options where they're not breaking the integrity of their biosecurity on the site? So another discussion is in high path AI, manure had to be moved under a movement permit. So what happens if you're not going to receive that permit to move manure off the site? What are you going to do? So those are things for producers to start thinking through what their options are. I had mentioned the biosecurity training. And if there's training that goes on or within a company or already or within a system, that's great. But we do have some resources for those that don't have those options. We have a couple wall charts that we did for the National Pork Board. They have those available. They're laminated kind of as a reminder that you can put in the barns. We also have 4 narrated PowerPoints. They're 5 minutes each. One is an introduction to biosecurity, why it's important. One is not bringing disease to the site, so the fact that if you have animals on your own site and things you should do before you leave. Another one's on the perimeter buffer area and how to respect it, and another one's the line of separation. And then the 5th one that we're working on, we don't quite have ready yet, is biosecure bench entry. We were asked to do one on bench entry so that employees know how to cross the bench correctly. Surveillance is very important. As was stated, we don't have that oral fluid validated test right now. So our options, we do have a surveillance document for secure pork highlighting some of the pros and cons of what's available right now. And as soon as there is a validated oral fluid test, that's something that we will incorporate into the plan. So one option for producers would be to start making sure that they are versed in collection. And I know that there's a lot of sites that do their own oral fluid collections right now. We do have some training resources on oral fluid collection in English and Spanish, and some right now just in English on nasal swab collection. And then there's another resource that we're just about finished with on how to correctly submit those samples to the diagnostic lab. We have a concern that when the regulatory officials' resources are outstripped in a large outbreak, that producers may be needed and hopefully will be granted permission. We're still working on that side of things to be able to collect their own samples, because you guys are really good at that already. So, the other thing that was mentioned is to know what the clinical signs are for these diseases. And, producers go in and look at these pigs every day. It's just as long as they know what they're looking for and at what point their production parameters have changed enough that the red flags go off. And then make sure that they're within their system. Or, if you're the owner and these are your buildings, obviously you're going to know who to call. You may be calling your veterinarian. But if it's an employee, did they call their manager first? Is it okay if they call the veterinarian? Make sure that that's all communicated, that if they see things that they know who to call. So there are wall charts that are laminated. They're available at the pork store. These are also available as PDFs as far as the pocket guides in English and Spanish. The wall charts are in English and Spanish also. So if you want any of those, let me know. Or Patrick would love to have them shipped to you to help as far as identifying clinical signs. We have some modules like we do the lessons for biosecurity that we're working on also on identifying the diseases. They'll be finished soon for ASF, CSF, and FMD. And it's already been discussed how important record keeping is, so I won't keep going over that. So kind of in summary, how can you prepare now? As far as the PIN is very important, make sure you either have one, or if you have one, that it actually is the location of the animals. Get that site-specific enhanced biosecurity plan written. Get anything implemented prior that you can. There's some things on there that might be difficult or expensive to do prior to. One of the things I think of is a C&D station. That's not something you're necessarily going to set up ahead of time, but just make sure you know where you're going to get your supplies from and how you're going to do it. Review the clinical signs associated with FMD, CSF, and ASF. Review the information on sample collection and submission. Make sure you're recording those animal movements and have the pins associated with those, and be able to track other movements on and off the site, including equipment and supplies. So these are what our old websites look like. So if you go to Secure Pork right now, this is what you're going to see, or milk or beef. And I apologize, but we're still working. Our goal is in the next couple of months to have the new one ready to go. So if you go here, you're going to have some of the information I've talked about, the summary plan, all the sample collection information. There's some of the information that's not going to be there quite yet because we've been working on another site that's a little more user-friendly. So when you see this one, you'll know all the information on there is all up to date. The idea behind this one is you have a producer drop down, a veterinarian, regulatory officials, you got training materials and disease information. So the producers can just go to the producer section and see, oh, need my PIN, oh, here's my stuff to do my biosecurity plan. Whereas the regulatory officials might want the more in-depth documents that the producers may not want to read, or the veterinarians might say, how can I help my producers? Well, here's the information for me to know that I can go help them. So this is the site that we're working on right now. There's no harm in hoping for the best as long as you're always prepared for the worst.